Good evening. I'm Peter Stothard, editor of the Times Literary Supplement, one of the many papers that Christopher has graced and... no, he's never disgraced the TLS, no. He's graced and disgraced... No, only graced us.
I will take another run at saying that.
I was...
Fine introducer, you say.
Yeah. Well, the last, I always remember the last time I saw Christopher at Hay, we were just discussing this. He was sort of standing sort of there, sitting there. And on this stage here was a very pleased with himself, self-satisfied former president of the United States. And I was sitting up there with a pretty good view. And as the former president got to a particularly unacceptable part of his foreign policy address, there was a slow rising about there as Christopher gradually and painfully and slowly and very visibly walked out. So if anybody comes in late, called Bill and looking aggressive and difficult, it's best if you put him at the end of the row. This is the first outing for Christopher's extraordinary memoir of a part of his life. Not all the parts of his life, but many parts of his life. Hitch 22. It's great that it's doing it first at Hay. Bill Clinton was a big part of the kind of world of Oxford where he and I first met and where you met a lot of the characters in this book. And I think we'll start with Oxford. Bill Clinton, Martin Amis, Jane Fenton. Oxford made the man or not?
I don't think it made Bill Clinton. I left that night because I couldn't stand the way that he dodged his responsibility for not just at first ignoring the genocide in Rwanda, but later on supporting the French intervention in Rwanda, which was on the side of those who had committed the genocide. That still doesn't stand to his charge. It should do. In general, I couldn't stand the sight of him. I remember how serious and how brave and how committed the young Americans were at Oxford when I was there, the young Rhodes Scholars mainly, who were in the terrible position of having to be ambassadors for their country, scholarly ambassadors, at a time when their country was committing an unjust war in Indochina and was repressing the demand of civil rights at home, and how squarely they all faced it, and how sinuously Bill Clinton dodged between the raindrops of all that. Martin Walker, who was a contemporary of ours, also who became Bill's biographer, his book in America is called Bill Clinton, The President We Deserve. The English edition is called Bill Clinton, The President They Deserve. Again, very deft piece of publishing by Martin. Swears that I was present. I don't remember it particularly. The moment when Clinton didn't inhale, which for those of you who don't know, is the moment when, because he's allergic to smoke and doesn't inhale anyway, when he would cram marijuana into himself by way of brownies and cookies. He's never inhaled. So when I later heard his claim, I tried it but I didn't inhale, I laughed louder than most people because everyone knew he was lying, but I knew why he was lying, and even how. So in general, it was a good thing being at Oxford because you could see the quality of the people who wanted to be one day Prime Minister or President. And you think, well, if ever they make it, I'll be able to say I knew them when. Surely some mistake has been made. And also because at the Oxford Union and other places, or at the Labour Club, you could invite the members of the government to come, and they would. And you could find out that they hardly knew... No, I was about to use a vulgar expression. That they didn't know much more than you did. It was a confidence-building experience.
Yeah, and indeed, the first time I think I ever set eyes on you was at the Oxford Union when there was the noose was famously hung down over Michael Stewart in the Vietnam
yes,
protesting.
I say in my book I'm a bit embarrassed about that now because I think above all things I'm in favor of free expression and free speech and unfettered debate, and it was probably wrong of us, and it was my idea, that after the invasion of Cambodia, an extension of an already terrible war, and the shooting of 4 unarmed students at Kent State University in Ohio, and, which is always forgotten, 4 unarmed black students at Jackson State in Mississippi. We thought an ordinary everyday protest wouldn't quite meet the case. We thought we should tell the Foreign Secretary that he was a war criminal and a murderer, and sort of suit the action to the word. So we even dropped a noose from the gallery of the Union and shut the debate down, hoping, I think, this is what I say in my book, that word of this would get to the people of Indochina and they'd feel somehow encouraged that a load of rubbish students from a Brideshead regurgitated generation really cared about them. Look, it seemed important at the time, and I had a huge quarrel with Jack Straw about it, who was then head of the National Union of Students, who said, "You've really messed up. The free expression is what people care about and should care about the most. That comes first."
Yeah. But this was a time which particularly students today have to be kind of focused on, because that sort of dinner jacket and donkey jacket life that you were living at this time, protesting, at Cowley Works during the day and then sort of eating and drinking with Isaiah Berlin at night, as it were, is not something, I think, it was pretty unique to that period.
Yeah, well, I'd had a rather limited upbringing and a rather Spartan education in a monastic boys' school, and I thought, if I'm going to go to Oxford, I'm certainly going to carry on being a socialist and an ally of the working class and all that. But there's no reason to be miserable on top. I mean, it's tough enough being a socialist and an ally of the working class. And if John Sparrow says, "Come to dinner at All Souls," go to dinner at All Souls. Maybe it's true what they say about the china, the silver, the wine, and so forth. It collided, though, as I had to describe in my book, when I was giving a rabble-rousing speech with some success, and I saw the villainous figure of the cynical figure of Warden Sparrow cleaving through the crowd towards me, and everyone falling back, like Moses parting the Red Sea. He was the most hated figure at Oxford at the time. And he came up and said, "My dear Christopher, I'm awfully sorry to have missed your speech. I'm sure it was quite admirable, but I just wanted to remind you, you had promised to look in after dinner tonight." And I heard the cocks crowing. I could have pretended I didn't, "I know thee not, old man, fall to thy prayers." I couldn't do it. I said, "No, see you later." I think rather admirably. Muted applause for that.
Yes. I don't think we can leave.
So the whole book is about trying to have a double life or 2 lives without being a hypocrite, or without being a schizophrenic, or without being a sellout. I mean, Scott Fitzgerald says somewhere that the test of a serious person is whether they can live with contradictions or not, and everyone does, whether they admit it or not. The first thing is to admit that you are doing so. And that can be educational. In fact, in those days, I would have said it was dialectical. Yes.
Okay, let's reel back then. So before Oxford, there was quite a good example of the dialectical, and the description of your parents in this book is something which a lot of people didn't know before. We know your arguments, we know what you stand for, we know the consistencies, we know a lot about your thought, but we didn't know where, as it were, you came from. So I think since this is an autobiography, we should say something just now, just describing the differences between your parents, because that clearly played some part in this.
Well, without my parents, I wouldn't have been to any university or had any education at all, because they hadn't had any. No Hitchens had been to a university before, or let alone to a private school. And for them, it was the ticket out of being military family. They both served in the Navy in the war, come out of the slum, sort of moved up a bit through the armed forces. The seal on that is the eldest son gets an education, and the first real parental argument I can remember, you've all sat on the stairs at some point, listening to a domestic dispute below, and this one I followed with particular interest because my mother was saying, we have to find the money to send Christopher to a proper school, and my father was saying, as far as I knew, truthfully, well, we haven't got the money. And Yvonne, as I always called her, because it was her name, and because it was the name by which I loved her, said, look, Eric, that was my father's name, if there's going to be a ruling class in this country, Christopher is going to be a member of it. And I thought, as one does sitting in the dressing gown at the top of the stairs, the jammies, yes. I was a bit nervous about going away to school at the age of 7, but I knew that it was my only chance. And that exemplifies the difference. My mother was a very outgoing, very extrovert, very rather optimistic, very beautiful woman with an interest in fashion and a sort of lust for life, which had been denied her by the very dreary circumstances of being a Navy wife in a time of austerity. And I say, she was the cream in the coffee. She was the gin in the Campari for me. And my father was a very honest and decent, but very depressed and rather pessimistic guy. And so how can I put this properly? I got out of that sort of lower middle class, very conservative background. I went to schools where none of the other boys had any idea they were lucky. They didn't think that they were privileged. I thought I was lucky. They took it completely as their due. They just thought it was their right to have an education away from the oiks and the proles. So that had a very revolutionary effect on me. And my father had been let go by the Navy after Suez, passed over for promotion and dumped with a lower pension than the officers who then joined, who hadn't been in the war, as he had been very bravely. So I thought, there's another case, someone who's been very loyal to the conservative interest, but has nothing to show for it, has been essentially sold out by it. So that moved me very strongly and quickly to the left, but I didn't forget that these virtues of martial valor, thrift, and so on were worth having. And I thought that they might even come in handy as socialist virtues too. So it wasn't rebellion as such, it was an attempt to transmute the lead into some kind of gold.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most moving bits of the book is you're looking for the anti-fascist fight in your parents. The notion that there should be one or 2 days when life is really worth living.
Yes.
And if there's any kind of theme in this book, it's that your parents had that, your father had that when he helped to bring down the Scharnhorst, and your aunt had it when they sort of went over in Dunkirk and D-Day. And the fight is to find those days, to find enemies that are worth fighting and fight them. And that you saw that in your parents as well as...
Yeah, they were all church-going, well, not my mother, as I'll say in a second, but church-going, patriotic, monarchical, pro-empire. But my father's ship on Boxing Day 1943 sent a big Nazi battleship right to the bottom of the sea, which is a better day's work than any I've ever done. And my aunt Ina, as a nurse, was in Wave 2 in Normandy and got all the way to Berlin before they stopped her. And my mother, who I think had a different motive, having come from a Jewish family in Liverpool, for disliking Nazism, also joined the Wrens, as they called it, the Women's Royal Navy Service, and went to a very bitter job in Scapa Flow. So there was nothing to deplore in this, even though I felt that they were, so to speak, all voting for the wrong party and admiring the things like monarchy and empire that I didn't think you needed to admire to be against fascism.
But
so it was interesting and complex in that way.
Yeah, it is complicated because the real opposition to them was they were kind of defeated, weren't they? I mean, your father was kind of defeated. So he knew about the Falklands and had played some, and knew more about the Falklands than you did, but he didn't support the regaining of the Falklands because he thought, well, too hard to...
Yes, he thought it was all over. He thought, if you read the poems of Philip Larkin, say, or even at a lower level, the letters of Dennis Thatcher to Private Eye, you have an impression of the way my father would talk when the gin was getting a bit low. It's all up with the old country. The place is run by yobs now. People get rich by making money, not by earning it. And all of this was, he didn't know it was a satire in a way on Thatcherism and on some kinds of capitalism, but it was just a feeling that the baser element had triumphed and that the old glories were departed.
But your mother, of course, was significantly different from this in terms of her preparedness to get out of it, or her desire to escape from this.
Oh, she tried so hard. She tried so hard to get out of it. She wanted to open a dress shop. She wanted to wish she could have cocktail parties that people would come to. She signed me up at the Chichester Festival Theatre, a name which still sounds to me like a knell in certain ways. Wanted there to be gaiety and art and humour, and having, as both of them had, life first of the slump, the recovery from the First World War, then the war, another one, and then a long period of austerity, rationing, poverty. By that time, they were in their 50s. Where had the youth gone? Where had it all gone? I remember feeling, it's an awful thing to feel sorry for your parents, but I did. I felt protective of them. I thought I was bringing them up. But she always had a resource of wit to help out on that.
But then when she did,
and she bought me a dinner jacket to go to Oxford with, and then I exchanged it for a donkey jacket, and she had to see me being arrested on the TV news all the time. And would say things like, "Oh, darling, I mean, I don't terribly mind. It's just that I do a bit when my friends ring up and say they're so sorry to see you."
But then when she did break out, there was the tragedy, which is one of the great tragedies in this of this book, which you don't have to talk about if you don't want to. People can read the book to find it. But it is a very, very extraordinary tale.
Well, if I've written about it, I guess I have to be asked about it. I mean, my father was a very honest man and a very brave and honourable one, and very sparing with himself and very self-denying. And in many ways an exemplary character, but in the words that I learned from my mother, he was boring. He bored her. And she used to say to me, "That's the one thing you can't do, it's the one unforgivable sin." And so when she could, when my brother and I were grown up, she exchanged him for a guy who wasn't boring at all, who was a bad poet and a charmer, and a former spoiled priest of the Church of England, and an all-round, plausible character, but who was bipolar and a failure, and couldn't hold a job, and whose charm wore off. And I think she realized that the last love of her life was a flop, and she wasn't going to get another chance. And she could see it stretching all before her, and decided that life wasn't on those terms worth living anymore, and made a suicide pact with him. I think under pressure from him. I had to do a long investigation at one point. And killed herself with him in an act that was first reported in the papers as a murder. So I had to go to Greece when I read about it, thinking I was going to a crime scene and arriving at one, and then finding that no, it wasn't, that she loved him enough to even if she didn't want to die, she loved someone who did badly need to die and wanted to take her with him. So that was a facer, and a particularly bad one for my father, because he knew she was with another guy, but it wasn't public. They were very respectable about it. If he needed her to come with him to a sherry party, she'd go, and there'd be nothing said. So everyone found out about it, and about her, all on the same day, and in the press. It must have been a titanic shock for him.
Yeah.
So that was the end of my family life, in a way.
Yeah, and after that, the book turns political, I think would be fair to say, not least in Greece, where the Hitchens story of looking out at the world, finding out which side you're on, and going hell against them. I suppose that was quite an easy one in a sense, I suppose, being against the bad guys in Greece. It got a bit harder later on.
People forget, when they remember the 60s, they think about Vietnam, of course, and Czechoslovakia, and Cuba, and Mozambique, and the rest of it. And of course, the famous events in Paris. But what they forget, well, maybe they don't. I'm sure there's some people who don't, but that in 1967, as the 60s were really getting underway, the military coup in Greece that brought to what we always called the cradle of democracy, this regime of steel helmets and dark glasses and sadists and torturers was an unbelievable thing. I mean, here's a NATO country in what our bosses are calling the free world, and it's given up without protest to this gang of thugs, which was still in power when my mother's body was found there. And I can't see the audience properly because of the lights, but who here has seen the film Zed, sometimes called Z, by Costa Gavras? Not bad. The best political thriller ever made on screen, about the murder of Grigori Lambrakis, a famous Greek oppositionist. And the coroner who I had to see in my mother's case was the same man who had said that Lambrakis had been killed by hitting his head on the pavement and not by the truncheon from a secret policeman in the pay of the Greek royal family, who had, in fact, it was later found, killed him. So I was in this surreal world of pursuing a murder investigation that became a suicide inquest with the guy who was the chief, so to say, necropolitan spokesman for this filthy regime. So it was a very intense week, yeah. And taught me something that I already knew, which is that it's very hard to have a non-political private life. It's a funny thing. You may wish you could. I wish everyone could have. I'm a great respecter of the private life. I hate totalitarianism and theocracy because it claims to take over the private life, but try as you may to lead it, you will keep on finding that politics invades it. And you may as well know that is going to happen to you.
I mean, one thing that's clear is your parents' sort of acceptance becomes the template for your resistance, if you like. So you find that other people perhaps are prepared to accept, don't care too much about the Greek colonels, don't care too much about what's going on in Northern Ireland, or don't care at all about what's going in Argentina. And your boom, boom, boom sort of determination to make sure that people do care. And that is the theme of this thing, of choosing a side and just making sure everybody else knows about it.
Well, that's very generous, Peter, but and thank you. But before we leave the parents, well, we don't have to if you don't want to.
It seems to be that it's against that acceptance.
Here's the thing: neither of them had the same politics as I did. Really at all. My mother was more liberal than my father, but not by that much, or not in the terms I was using anyway. But what I found was, when I fulfilled all their expectations by getting to Oxford and getting to Balliol at that, which is the one I'd set out to do, which, in case you don't know, is the College of Effortless Superiority.
Until the University Challenge.
Till by representing it on University Challenge, I dealt that reputation a blow from which it still not recovered. And then disappointed them by spending all my time at Oxford not going in that dinner jacket to fashionable and classy events, but getting roughed up by the police and so forth. For all that, they both thought that at least I was doing it on principle. And since all the things they'd done in their lives were done out of some kind of conviction, they thought, well, at least, even if it's the wrong thing, at least he's doing it for that reason. And that was a very touching tribute I had from both of them that I never expected to have. But though I now wonder, with the advantage of advancing years, whether I was seeking that kind of praise from them without realizing I was doing it.
It's very touching, the pride that your father took in your press cuttings, even though they were so alien to what he wanted to say.
My father, who would say things like, "What do you think what's going on in Northern Ireland?" And I'd been in Ulster a lot, and I'd try and say this. He said, "Don't you think it's time for a good dose of martial law?" As if British force had never been tried in Ireland before. He really was like that. I found out that he was later, quite by chance, that he was giving Christmas gift subscriptions to the New Statesman to his few remaining old sea dog naval friends, saying, "I don't know if you ever see this magazine. My son occasionally writes an article." I was thunderstruck by that. And I used to wonder if... He also told me once he thought I'd been brave to go to Beirut to write a piece about the war there. That really amazed me, because he'd been on the Arctic convoys and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, maybe that's what I was looking for, yes.
Right.
A vertiginous thought.
The way the book then takes on a whole series of these conflicts that you've been involved in, and some of which most of your friends have agreed with you, and a lot of them people have seriously disagreed with you. Which do you think of all? Which was the hardest call? So this is one. Which was the? Is it always so clear who's right and who's wrong as it appears to be when you're writing about it?
Well, what I try and say is that everyone has to find this out for themselves, but whatever your political prejudice or allegiance may be, the critical thing is to be consistently anti-totalitarian. Now, that may sound very easy. Who's in favor of totalitarianism? No one says they are. But if you went to a meeting in favor of the African National Congress, for example, which I often did, I knew I was speaking on the same platform as several people who were members of the South African Communist Party, which was then the most pro-Moscow Communist Party in the world. I thought, okay, on this bit, I'm willing to fight alongside them and shoulder to shoulder with them, but we'll later have a big disagreement about Czechoslovakia. I'll make sure that we do. Partly to be true to myself, partly to test my arguments against theirs. Same with some of the people I identified with in Poland against the communist dictatorship. There, I knew that many of them were extreme right-wing. They wouldn't say it in public, but they were quite right-wing, often quite anti-Semitic nationalists. I say, well, okay, I'm with you about the Warsaw Pact, but we have a further fight coming. The whole joy of being a revolutionary is that the revolution is within the revolution. So the book, which, by the way, is available at fine bookstores everywhere, attempts to be true to that thought, that the struggle is never over, but that it's worth having for its own sake, win or lose. And, you asked me what the hardest one was.
Well, sometimes the price has been quite high, hasn't it? I mean, sometimes you've taken positions...
Well, the price is that you can yourself be accused of being a communist or a fascist, say, because of the company you keep. And this is a vulgar way of thinking, but people use it a lot, so that having been in favor of the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime for quite a long time, one can get accused of being, I don't know, Bush's poodle or some idiotic allegation like that. I guess since I've mentioned Iraq, I would say, and you asked me what was the hardest, that was the hardest. Something that seems self-evident to me, that Iraq should not be the private property of a psychopathic, aggressive, law-breaking crime family, wasn't as evident as I thought it was to everyone else. They all thought, no, this must be to do with some neocon Israeli lobby's sinister work. And I have a whole chapter about this, trying to set my part of the record straight, give some idea of what the regime change left actually did do and did think in Iraq and in Kurdistan as well as elsewhere, against the unbelievable tide of calumny and defamation that one had to endure for it. And there's a whole different risk being run, which is that you have to be boring about it. The one thing my mother told me I should never be. No, okay, I'll come back to this argument again and again. I'll be the last one standing. I'll dry you out. I'll bore you to tears. I know about this. I'm not going to have the historical record written by liars. And yeah, that was the toughest by far. But we won, and now Iraq is a free country. And everyone is terribly upset by it. Fantastically upset they don't forgive the liberation of Iraq.
No, but
their rightness matters so much to them.
But, you know, can the price ever be too high, even when you choose the right... Even when
you can't know that in advance. You can give a rough idea of what the price of having Iraq continually controlled by Saddam Hussein would have been. If you like, I'll give you an actual example that's partly mentioned in the book. During the period of the sanctions, the anti-war movement would come to me every week and say, don't you realize the sanctions are killing... The figures varied, but it was up to 100,000 young people and old people in Iraq every year. I thought the figures were exaggerated, but not by much. I mean, they were doing that. So I'd say, right, I agree with you, this is a terrible suffering imposed on the Iraqi people by the United Nations mandated legal international sanctions, by the way, but still, all right, let's lift the sanctions. But the price of that must be removing the regime, mustn't it? Because why are people suffering so much? Because while the Iraqis are starving, Saddam has built one palace in every province of the country, just to name one thing, just in his own name. It's sanctions plus Saddam that do the damage. So remove the regime, we can lift the sanctions. They would all say, we're not against the death of 100,000 Iraqis a year that much. Removing the dictator, much too high a price. That's bad faith, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. That's bad faith. They didn't care as much as they said they did. Now we have removed the sanctions and the regime and presumably cut the civilian casualties at least significantly to that extent and for that reason. Any thanks for it? Not that I've heard lately. No.
Now, people may want to come back on the argument.
That's just an instance.
But I just, yeah.
Here, it's a question there not of what you think, but of how you think, and that's how I think.
But this is a memoir, an autobiography. It's about people. It's about you and your friends and your supporters and your enemies.
And our games.
And sometimes people let you down. I mean, on those occasions, and on Salman Rushdie too, there's that strong sense that sometimes even the people really close to you just don't get it. And
no.
There's a real, I mean, that's the personal side of these arguments that comes over.
Look, there's a friend of mine at this festival who can be mentioned, I think, in the same name, same breath as Salman's. I have a whole chapter about Salman I hope you would like to read, but she's called Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she was born in Somalia, and on her own guess, and I think it's accurate, is the only girl in her class who's still alive. And she's incredibly charming and amusing because she amazingly thinks she's lucky, as she is, to be the only one alive. And she has survived beating, genital mutilation, forced marriage, various kinds of exile and cruelty, and also seen the total destruction of her society by theocratic goons. And there are a lot of people who think they would have sympathized with her only if she'd stayed where she was. But now that she's left all that and said goodbye to religion, goodbye to tribalism, goodbye to theocracy, she's accused of being a friend of secular Enlightenment types, you know, who don't sympathize enough with the well springs of religious belief. Well, honestly, what a waste of freedom for people to talk about her like that. And it was the same with Salman. Here's a case, Valentine's Day 1989. The verminous theocratic leader of a foreign state that's ruined itself in war and fascism, with the war with Iraq, the demolition of its civil society, whose country's in hopeless trouble, who's trying to promote himself, thinks the best way to recover credibility is to offer money in his own name, in public, to suborn murder of a writer of fiction who lives in London and isn't an Iranian. I think that's a pretty frontal assault on everything that I love, starting with and ending with the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. A huge number of liberals and leftists say, no, the problem is not the fatwa, the problem is the novel. How does Mr. Rushdie expect to upset a great religion and get away with it? This is defeat in the mind. This is masochism of the most disgusting kind. You don't need, as Aneurin Bevan, that great Welshman, said, you don't need to muzzle a sheep. People will do all the work for you. They'll beckon on the tyranny. They'll welcome it. And the next thing you know, the worst kind of relativism has set in.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, they know.
However, one or two people have fallen out along the way in this. Not everybody has. There's a particularly good back cover for this book, which has all the usual sort of praise by Joseph Heller, Richard Dawkins, Ian McEwan, and then says...
You think that's usual?
Oh, I think so.
I had to work bloody hard to get that.
And then has a quote from Gore Vidal. I have been asked whether I wish to nominate the successor and inheritor a Dauphin or Delfino. I have decided to name Christopher Hitchens. This, however, is firmly struck out, and thereby must hang a tale.
Yeah, well, about 12 years ago, I got a call from Gore, from Italy, saying, Christopher, do you know what the word Delfino means? And I said, actually, I don't. I didn't say, should I guess? I think I might have done. But he said, well, it's the Italian for dauphin. And I've been brooding. And he went on to say that he, as in advancing years, never having had a son, whether he should be anointing a successor. And he said, I thought of naming you. And I said, well, that's very handsome of you. I think that the architecture of the novels of the history of the United States that he's raised is extremely impressive. And he's also written some very, very enviable essays indeed. I would instance, I don't know, The Holy Family, the first one to really take the axe to the root of the Kennedy myth, and everyone probably has their favorite. So I was very gratified. He then wrote it down and sent it me as a letter. I kept it, and then a few years later I asked if I could use it as a blurb for a book, and he said yes. I partly intended that, so I did. And then something happened that I also knew might happen, which was that if you know Gore, you know that he may seem very radical and even quite left-wing, and very liberal, but in fact he's very conservative, and he's a supporter of the extreme right isolationist tradition of the United States that goes back to Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement before the Second World War, opposed to the American rescue of Europe, and let's say, to put it delicately, non-Philo-Semitic in its manner. Actually, distinctly non-Philo-Semitic. And I knew that he had this tendency in him, and the conspiratorial view that goes with it. But after 9/11, he gave it full rein and essentially said, it's too early to say, he wrote these words, it's too soon to tell whether Mr. bin Laden has anything to do with the blowing up of the World Trade Center. He's by no means the proven perpetrator. But it wasn't for him too early to say that he thought the Bush administration had arranged the blowing up of the World Trade Center. So I thought, no, come on, that's that. This is not a difference of emphasis at all. That's a root and branch difference. And we had a big quarrel. And he began to take back what he'd said about me. And I thought, well, since he's known to like a good feud, he can have one, can't he? And so I both reprinted it and crossed it out. So he can suck on that.
We haven't talked very much about literature, and time is running on. I'm not sure we should... what about the King of China?
Oh, Christ.
We haven't done the King of China.
We haven't done...
It's very important.
We haven't done the limericks.
We haven't done the limericks. And
what would you like to do?
I think the King of China is the key to understanding...
You think the King of China? It's a little arcane.
It's a little arcane? Come on, they're great.
They must wonder what we're...
Yes, they don't understand. You explain with the rules.
Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the book, I give instances of word games and dirty rhymes that I think are justified, well, actually partly for their own sake, but also because the more you do them, the better you get at them. And they can help to sort of build muscle in the use of language. And Peter likes very much the King of China, but I don't know, I prefer the substitute. It's easier to do.
You're in charge.
Well, look.
But they'll have to buy the book to get the King of China.
I mean, it's puerile, of course, but I know that people like filth, honestly. They do. But the word games got better when our company was joined by the great, the imperishable Salman Rushdie, who I never can believe has English as his second language. That his first language is Urdu constantly amazes me. And he generally elevated the level of games. And actually, I owe my title in part to this, because one of his games was to think of a well-known title and think of how it didn't quite make it. The Big Gatsby. For Whom the Bell Rings. 2 Days in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Mr. Zhivago, Good Expectations. So I contributed a couple of these, Portrait of a Woman, for example, Henry James, and Hitch 22. I thought I may need that one day.
I think on that note, we will ask, is there any way of the lights being put up so that we can ask...
I don't know if I want to see them.
Gosh! Wow!
Oh.
We haven't been able to see any of this. There's, I can half see you, sir, there.
Your lapel badge, I can't see from here what it is. Could you tell us what it is and why it's significant to you?
It's the flag of Kurdistan. And the Kurdish people, as you may know, numbering between 40 and 45 million people, are the largest nation in the world without a state. And they live in a very unpromising area, roughly where the borders of Iran, Iraq, Turkey and Syria meet, which is not where you perhaps would want to pitch your tent if you hope to be an independent and free people, but they've been fighting for their liberty and recognition for a very long time. And when I was young, it was a solid cause of the left, and some of you will know, well, you all better know, that they were subjected to a very thoroughgoing experiment in chemical and biological warfare a few years ago, and were driven into a state of utter desolation. And now one of the biggest success stories of liberated Iraq, and in the northeastern three provinces of Iraq have, by the Iraqi constitution, their own independence, their own autonomy, their own parliament, and the right to strike bargains with other countries, to have an airport that receives flights direct from other countries, and so forth. It's the nearest they've ever got to having a free state. And in case you wonder, I'm on their side. And I think they need their friends. They also know who their friends are. They remember all those who filled the streets trying to keep Saddam Hussein in power.
There's a gentleman, no, the other side, sir. This chap here, yeah.
Good evening. In my opinion, you've made some valid criticisms on the influence of God and religion upon our society.
Thank you.
However, do you acknowledge that some notion of spirituality is pertinent to maintain a humility and perspective of our own existence, which does not necessarily depend on a notion of a God or a deity?
I had the experience last evening, of going in to hear evensong at the cathedral in Hereford. And just as the bells finished tolling, got there just in time for the start of the prebendal singers, and ran into Anthony Grayling on the way out, who, before I could say to him, "What are you doing here?" said, "Christopher, Hitch, what the hell?" And I said, no, I wouldn't miss it. And I'm glad I was there, by the way, because if it wasn't for me and a couple of old ladies in motorized chariots, the choir, the prebendal choir, would be singing to an empty nave, which I think would have been a shame. And George Herbert, who I think is probably the greatest, along with John Donne, the greatest English religious writer and poet, was at Hereford. And Lawrence Traherne was at a parish, actually had the living of a parish just down the road. And you wouldn't want to and couldn't possibly be without that tradition. You'd lose a lot of your sense of moral proportion, I think. So the great cultural question to me is not how to reject religion, because that's easy enough to do, but how to transcend it, how to make something out of the extraordinary architecture, poetry, music, and painting that it's produced. I give the example, because it's not an English or a Christian one, or a monotheistic one at all, of the Parthenon, about which I wrote a book. If the Parthenon was to be destroyed, I don't know how one would go on contemplating things. It would be a loss greater than perhaps that of a friend almost, or a relative. And its existence, and indeed its restoration, means a great deal to me, and I've written a lot about it. But I have no interest at all in the cult of Pallas Athena, or the worship of her, or in the Eleusinian mysteries and that cult, or in fact in Athenian imperialism and the Melian expedition, about which Sir Peter knows a lot more than I do. But, so the cultural question is, how does one preserve, appreciate, enhance the symmetry and beauty of the Parthenon, while discarding superstition and the supernatural? And I believe that's a cultural task that everyone has something to contribute to.
Thank you.
I mean to say, sorry, to which everyone has something to contribute. Sorry.
Thank you. There's a gentleman there I can see, yes.
You actively pursued Henry Kissinger and wanted to see him brought to trial as a war criminal. Unfortunately, that's something I support. Unfortunately, it was a little bit derailed by obviously what happened at 9/11. I wonder what your thoughts are now about that, and whether you actually think you'll ever get him.
Well, it hasn't been totally derailed by 9/11. If you read the Washington Post on the 11th of September 2001, the front page headline was that Kissinger had been had been given leave to be sued in a federal court in Washington, D.C., where the family of a Chilean general who'd been murdered on his orders had brought a case in their own justification. This case did, alas, somewhat fizzle out, it's true, but we did get that far, and it's on the record. He was visited by the magistrates in Paris, just as my book came out in French, by Judge Roger Leloir, a very courageous magistrate, and detained briefly at the Hotel Ritz before skipping town. He doesn't travel now without lawyers or travel without legal advice. He's been asked by judges in Chile and Argentina, Judge Rodolfo Corral, who did the great investigation of the death squads of Argentina, and the judge in Chile who ran the Pinochet case, to appear for questioning, and has refused to do so. So he's somewhat been circumscribed in point of his movements, and very much, I think, in point of his reputation. And his obituaries won't be quite the same. Though, if he dies in his bed, I think it will be a great disgrace to Western civilization. Or not if he dies in his bed, he has the right to do that. But if he dies on the outside, it'll be a great disgrace to our claim to uphold the rule of law.
I can see a hand vigorously waved there. Even I can see it.
I wondered if you ever thought that you should get yourself elected and then you could be the Foreign Secretary and deal with the issues that you take up, so well, with the whole panoply of the state behind you.
Bad as things are, they are not so parlous that the people will have to call for me, I think. I did once, I don't mention it in my book, I thought of doing a chapter just on regrets and remorse and the difference between regret and remorse. If you've forgotten it, regret is for what you did do, and I'm sorry, regret is for what you didn't do, and remorse is for what you did. Regret is often worse. Anyway, in this chapter, I would have said that I wish now that I had listened to the guys in the Tavistock Labour Party who asked me to consider being their candidate when I was very young. It was then a seat held by Sir Henry Studholme, Conservative and National Liberal. I think Labour came fourth after Devon Nationalists or something. But it would have been it later fell into the hands of Michael Heseltine. But it would have been a noble seat to fight. I wish I'd at least run for Parliament. It should be the aspiration of everybody to serve their country in Parliament. And I didn't even try, and it's too late now. And then I was expelled from the Labour Party before I could think about it any further. And I'm proud of being expelled because it was because of Vietnam.
There's a very good ending to this book with quite a lot of advice for people of this kind, sort of a coda on. Not quite regrets and remorse didn't make it, but quite a lot of advice as to how you should live your life, and advice to young people, advice to young writers. Give us just a little flavour of how you think people should conduct themselves.
Well, there are two kinds of advice for writers. One is, well, the first thing is if you want to write, it must be the thing not that you want to do or would like to do, it must be the thing you feel you have to do. It must be that without which you could not live. If you've got that, then it'll be all right, because you'll survive the disappointments. And then I try to say to my students, if you can write, you can talk. You can talk if you can write. And they cheer up a bit at the first. You mean if I can talk, I can write? Yes. And then I say, well, how many people in this class like to hear the other ones talk? And then they get depressed all over again. But the idea is to find a voice. And I try and write as if I was speaking to people. And sometimes people say to me that they felt personally addressed, and then I feel vindicated. So there's that. And then I have some advice on avoiding the booze trap. which waits for many young writers. I know many people they got the garret, they got the bottle, they got the glass, they got the sheet of paper and the pen, then they drank all the bottle, and then that was all the writing that they did. And I was brought up with a lot of awful warnings of that kind, and alcohol is a professional deformation of the scribbler. So I have lots of advice about when to drink, how much, how not to mix, how it's a good servant and a bad master. And I described Clive James at one point, describing our boozy lunches, as saying Clive was rescued just from the master-servant relationship with alcohol. Though for a while, the role of alcohol in his life had been played by Dirk Bogarde. Some of them get it. But I still feel, 61 as I am, I still feel a bit of a curmudgeon giving advice to the young. I still secretly feel, they're not that much younger than me.
On which note...
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody.